The Marineford War is considered one of the greatest arcs in all of shonen anime and manga, let alone One Piece. This was a battle between the strongest pirate crew of the time against the entire force of the world government, and one which culminated in the death of both Luffy's brother Podcasty Ace and the strongest man in the world, Whitebeard. The death of these characters is still as heartbreaking today as it was when it had happened over 15 years ago, with the audience both praising and despairing Oda's decision to permanently kill off what were some of the most popular characters in One Piece at the time. Even after all of this time has passed, Ace still consistently ranks amongst the most popular One Piece characters in global fan popularity polls. This is why it should come as no surprise that so many fans still remain in denial over his death. Every so often, I see somebody theorizing a countless number of ways in which he could return to the story in what may be another example of one of Oda's famous fake-out deaths. While I don't believe that Ace will ever return to One Piece outside of flashbacks, I do agree that Ace's death at Marineford was entirely avoidable. This is why, for this video, I'm taking you through 50 ways in which Podcasty Ace could have survived the events of the Marineford War. I'll be covering everything ranging from the most obvious to the hilarious and ludicrous, to even some heartbreaking scenarios in which he may have survived. So we're going to start with the most obvious solution of all to the death of Ace, and it's something that every One Piece fan would have been yelling at Ace to do as they were first reading the chapter or watching the episode. So firstly, Ace could have continued running away from Akainu, because a surefire way that would have guaranteed Ace's survival is if he was to have avoided any confrontation with the Magma Admiral altogether. Regardless of any goading, mocking, or insults that Akainu could have thrown at him, if Ace had simply let them wash over him, he could have continued running to freedom, and then both he and Luffy would have been perfectly fine, alive and well to sail off into the next era. Now this is just one way in which Ace could have survived, and it's assuming that the events of Marineford even take place to begin with. What if there was a scenario where the events of Marineford never take place at all, and then naturally Ace would have continued to live? So Ace would have just simply had to have beaten Blackbeard so that Marineford doesn't happen. That epic clash on Bonaro Island was the spark which had led to the explosion, which was the Marineford War. If Ace didn't lose, then Marineford doesn't happen. And if this sounds interesting to you, then I would recommend that you check out my video on this topic where I theorize about what would have happened if Ace ended up beating Blackbeard. Now continuing with this theme, Marineford also would not have taken place if Luffy had been successful in his attempt to save Ace at Impel Down. If Luffy had managed to infiltrate Impel Down a few hours earlier, then the mass breakout could very well have included Ace within it. And without Ace as the centerpiece, the Marines have no one to execute, and the Whitebeard pirates have nobody to save. So the war ends even before it begins. Speaking of the war ending, next we can talk about the man who originally ended the war in the series, Redhead Shanks. Shanks' arrival was so impactful that it had stopped both Whitebeard and Blackbeard's crew along with the Marines in their tracks. Of course, his arrival came too late to save the lives of both Ace and Whitebeard, but what if it hadn't? If only Shanks had arrived even 2 minutes earlier, then it's possible that Ace's life could have been saved. Hopefully you'll understand how this video works now, as I'll be speedrunning through the next possibilities. If Luffy had managed to last slightly longer before collapsing from exhaustion, then it would have removed the need for Ace to dive in front of Akainu's killing blow. While the pair were already in a terrible situation, as Ace had already lost his initial clash with Akainu at this point, it was Luffy's collapse into a defenseless state which had directly caused Ace's death. If Luffy managed to stave off of those effects for even a few more minutes, then he and Ace may well have managed to escape safe and sound. Next, what if it was another admiral who was chasing after Ace and Luffy? We had seen that Ace's Maromi acts as a counter to Aokiji's ice power. Now this may have resulted in a more favorable outcome for Ace. And while Kizaru's speed is unmatched, his destructive power is still slightly below that of Akainu and Aokiji. While there is no chance of Ace defeating either of them in a fight, I am not convinced that either of them would have been able to defeat Ace as quickly as Akainu did, especially in the middle of a war where time is of the essence. Following this, the same would apply if Whitebeard had been 10 years younger. If the strongest man in the world was slightly less hampered by the effects of old age, it is entirely possible that the Whitebeard pirates would have won the war in its entirety. We already saw the aftermath of an ailing, disease-ridden Whitebeard who nearly managed to destroy the Marine Citadel in its entirety. But what if Whitebeard was in his prime? I think in this situation he could have easily beaten all 3 of the admirals combined. And in this situation, I don't think that Akainu would have had the opportunity to kill Ace. Speaking of strong characters intervening, if another legend from the previous era, Silver's Rayleigh, had decided to sober up and fetch his sword and swing his way over to Marineford, I believe that his involvement could have played an instrumental role in saving the lives of both Whitebeard and Ace. Rayleigh was the former second in command of Goldie Roger, and he could easily be considered as one of the strongest pirates in the world. Someone who is capable of fighting one-on-one against admirals, as we had seen against Kizaru during Shabodi. The reason behind why Rayleigh decided not to act during Marineford is unknown, but his presence would have swung the flow of the battle completely, and it may just have been the thing that was needed to save Ace's life. To be honest, this fact would have held true for any of Roger's former crewmates. While Scooper Gabin may be the next name anyone thinks of with the Roger pirates, we do actually know the names of a further 30 of the Pirate King's former crew. And while it's unlikely that many of them will be as strong as Rayleigh, it's also really unlikely that any of them would be weak. In terms of Roger's former crewmates, the issue is we don't know their location, strengths, or even whether if they are still alive or not. In terms of really powerful characters intervening to save Ace, there are few who are stronger than the marine hero Monkey D. Garp. Ace's execution was a heartbreaking situation for Garp, as he was forced to choose between his duty to the Marines and his familial bond with Portgas D. Ace. I'm sure that all of you can agree that Garp had made the wrong decision here. We saw Garp's reaction following Ace's death, where he had to be held back by his lifelong friend Sengoku in order to prevent him from killing Akainu. If Garp had only come to this realization sooner and developed these feelings of protectiveness and love for Ace, as he understands that Ace is way more important to him than the Marines ever were, I believe that Garp's interference would have undoubtedly saved his grandson, but at the cost of his job, reputation, and almost certainly his life. The man responsible for Ace's death was Akainu, which means that if we remove him from the equation, then Ace survives. So if Akainu just happened to be on the wrong side of the battlefield and was unable to get close enough to taunt Ace, then I think that Ace and Luffy wouldn't have had an issue with escaping from Marineford. But we can go even further in our attempt to remove Akainu if we consider, for example, that Akainu had been properly reprimanded for ordering the slaughter of the innocent scholars during the Ohara incident. He may never have been promoted to Admiral in the first place. Akainu being punished would have significantly impacted the events of Marineford, as he would not have been free enough to do as he pleases in pursuing Ace during the battle. A similar event would occur, of course, if Akainu decided to focus more on taking out Whitebeard than Ace and Luffy, thus allowing the pair to successfully flee to the escape ships while Akainu fights against Whitebeard. It's not too difficult to believe that Akainu would have targeted one of the Yonko. With Whitebeard being a Yonko, he was a greater threat to the overall safety of the world than Ace and Luffy. Most people would agree that this isn't the case though, and that the threat posed by Ace and Luffy is magnitudes higher than an old Whitebeard. This of course is due to the potential that they possess to become a real issue for the Marines in as little as even 2 to 5 years. Ace isn't the only one on the battlefield with the potential though, and just 2 short years later we have seen just what kind of heights that Luffy has been able to reach. If during this time Luffy's wounds from Impel Down had been greater or the effects of his cure less effective, then Luffy's heart may well have stopped beating during the battle at Marineford. And as we all saw during the Wano arc when Luffy had fought against Kaido, when he was killed by Kaido, it had awakened something within Luffy which even Yonko and Admiral level threats would struggle to face off against. If Luffy truly did activate Gear 5 during Marineford, then I would be completely confident in his ability to save both himself and Ace. Another way that Marineford could have been avoided in its entirety is if we go back to Bonaro Island, where Ace and Blackbeard had their epic battle. A fight that could have been absolutely avoided if Ace had accepted Blackbeard's offer to join his crew. This would go against Ace's entire character character though, and it would make absolutely no sense within the narrative. However, it is still one way in which he could have survived, albeit it is a pretty nonsensical way. A much happier outcome would be if Ace had managed to defeat Blackbeard in their battle, and Blackbeard's crew at that point in time posed next to no threat against someone like Ace, so if he had managed to overcome Blackbeard, he would have avenged Thatch and returned to Whitebeard safe and sound, with a great evil eliminated before it ever had a chance to grow. Let's stick with Blackbeard and consider a scenario where he manages to capture Luffy instead of Ace, as this is what he had originally planned. It's interesting to think about how Marineford would have played out if Luffy was captured instead of Ace. Would Garp have been able to protect Luffy? Would Luffy have been put up for execution in a similar manner to Ace? Would Dragon have intervened? Would Ace have been able to call upon the Whitebeards in order to help save his brother? This is definitely a very interesting what if scenario, and I'd love to know all of your thoughts about this alternative One Piece timeline where Luffy is captured instead of Ace. Marineford would have played out very differently if only Monkey D. Dragon would have actually made a move. This is something that fans have been waiting literal years for. In a situation where Dragon realizes the dangerous situation that Luffy has found himself in, and he decides to personally intervene, he would be able to throw the whole battlefield into even more chaos and allow Luffy and Ace to escape, in my opinion. Dragon had said to Kuma in his flashback that Luffy is his one and only weakness, and if he is as strong as we all believe, then there is no guarantee that even a Admiral level threat would be able to withstand Dragon's rage. Of course, without the intervention of Dragon, Luffy would remain in an incredible amount of danger, and in the heat of battle, it isn't unreasonable to assume that Luffy could awaken some stronger abilities as he did with his Conqueror's Haki. In a world where Luffy awakens Future Sight, for example, he would have been able to foresee the fate that would soon befall his brother, and thus he would refuse to allow another brother to die. Luffy would dive forward and push Ace out of the way of Akainu's killing blow, which now takes out Luffy instead. So one brother lives while the other dies, but only this time the roles are reversed. As we know, death in One Piece is not a guarantee of anything, and Oda loves bringing back characters from what should have been certain death. It is possible Oda could bring a character or characters back from actual death. For example, Chopper could come up with a cure for death itself, thus resurrecting both Ace and Whitebeard before their bodies had a chance to fully decompose into a Brook-like skeleton. Of course, Ace would still have a massive hole in his chest, and Whitebeard would still be missing half of his face, as well as the hundreds of other injuries that the two of them had sustained. This is assuming that Ace dies at all though. As mentioned, Oda loves keeping characters alive, and since he's the author, he could just decide that Ace survives this scenario that obviously should have killed him, just like he did for Pell, Wiper, Bellamy, Kanjuro, Kinemon, Igaram, and countless other characters. What if Oda just simply decided not to kill Ace? If Oda had actually listened to his editor Hattori, for example, who was staunchly against the idea of killing Ace, then Ace would still be alive and well in the story today. Next, we have what I think is one of the most interesting changes to consider when it comes to One Piece. What if Goldie Roger didn't get sick? This would have changed the course of the series massively. If Roger survived, there would be no Great Age of Piracy, no searching for the One Piece, no Ace growing up on Dawn Island, and more likely than not, no Ace joining the Whitebeard crew. This is a bit too out there even for this video, but in a world where Roger fakes his death, he would no doubt have personally intervened at Marineford in order to save his only son, something which not only would have shaken the entire world even more than Whitebeard's death, but also would have guaranteed Ace's survival and safety. I don't think we needed an extremely powerful character to intervene to save Ace, as I do believe that any number of characters could have just assisted Ace in blocking Akainu in order to save his life. While Akainu was stronger than the majority of pirates on the battlefield, we did see instances of him being blocked or overcome at least temporarily by similar strong opponents. You have the likes of Mako, Jinbei, Crocodile, Vista, and even Diamond Jozu demonstrating that they are capable of holding off an admiral like Aokiji for a decent amount of time. If they had combined their powers with Ace, it may have been possible to save Luffy's life without having to sacrifice Ace as a consequence. But Ace's power is also nothing to scoff at, and it's extremely interesting to explore just how strong Ace was in the grand scheme of One Piece, as I see both people comparing him to Yonko level whilst also saying that he will struggle to even fight against the weakest warlord. Whatever you think of his power, I think that everyone would agree that if he had managed to awaken the powers of the Maromi, his chances of survival would have skyrocketed, as the strength of his flames would have crept closer and closer to even the heights of Akainu's magma. I believe that this would have also held true if only Ace had been just a few years older. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy are all insanely strong characters, even by the standards of One Piece. At the age of 20, Ace was already an incredibly powerful fighter. If he had been 22 or 23, it is possible that he would have reached a level where he would have been able to withstand an attack from Akainu and not lose in the manner that he did, thus allowing him to escape with Luffy. Next, we need to look at the actions of another Yonko who influenced the events of Marineford, and this is the King of Beasts Kaido. If Kaido was more successful in his attempt to invade Marineford, overcoming the blockade which Shanks had tried to set up, then he could have undoubtedly caused enough of a commotion to obstruct Akainu from his goal of killing Ace and Luffy. Of course, this would have certainly been a death sentence for Whitebeard, since Kaido would likely be unwilling to not face off against the strongest man in the world. Since Whitebeard had entered into the battle at Marineford with the intention to die anyway, I don't think that he would have been bothered to give his life for the sake of his crew. All of this depends on if Kaido is successful in invading Marineford. Another possibility is that he has no interest in Marineford whatsoever and never bothers leaving the borders of Wano. This would mean that Shanks has no need to prevent him from reaching the war, meaning he is no longer stalled on his way to Marineford and he would arrive in time to save Ace. Now, another character that we have yet to talk about who was extremely influential during Marineford, it is none other than Trafalgar Law. Originally, it took all of Law's knowledge, talent, and the abilities of the Opi Opi no Mi in order to just save Luffy's life, who obviously suffered far lesser injuries than Ace. But what if Law's abilities were even better than what anyone could have imagined? If Ace's body had found its way onto the Heart Pirate ship, then maybe the Opi Opi no Mi could even allow someone to recover from death itself, assuming that they are operated on quickly enough after a fatal blow. From one extreme possibility to another, we have one that has even been acknowledged by Oda himself. What if Sabo had awakened his memories upon the announcement of Ace's capture? If this was the case, then undoubtedly Sabo would have intervened at Marineford in order to save Ace. This has the added bonus of at least being semi-canon, since Oda did actually draw this exact situation in a What If one-shot chapter. Looking at the Marineford War through a more tactical lens, it is possible that Whitebeard and his allies could have gone about the war another way. For example, the Whitebeard pirates could have, instead of attacking Marineford head-on, captured a celestial dragon in order to use as a hostage to save Ace. Since the entirety of marine power was centered at Marineford in the build-up to the execution, it would have been easier for Whitebeard or one of their affiliated crews to either capture a roaming celestial dragon or to attack Marijo like the revolutionaries did in order to find anyone important enough to allow for Ace to be spared. This isn't something impossible that hasn't been done before, because if you remember, Fisher Tiger on his own managed to infiltrate Marijo, which sparked a mass breakout of slaves. And then we also had the revolutionaries, which consisted of Sabo and their 4 commanders, who carried out an assault which decimated the celestial dragon's home. In terms of a crew with the strength of Whitebeards, they certainly would have been able to match the accomplishments of Fisher Tiger and the revolutionaries. I've no doubt that the world government would have exchanged Ace for the celestial dragons who they consider to be mortal gods. All of this could have been entirely avoided if Ace had simply listened to Garp from the very beginning and had decided to join the Marines. If Ace had joined the Marines like Garp had originally wanted, he never would have been executed in the first place. A lot of the blame can be attributed to Garp. If only he had tended to Ace's feelings about his father and his issues of abandonment, then Ace wouldn't have been so susceptible to Akainu's taunts. He could have simply brushed them off, ignored them, and then ran off to safety. There is a certain level of luck that could have saved Ace too, regardless of anything else that would have happened. For example, if the explosions and cries of the battlefield had been so loud that they had completely drowned out Akainu's taunts, then Ace would have never heard them and therefore would have had no reason to turn back and confront him. Or if you want to get even more ridiculous in terms terms of luck, then Akainu could have slipped on Aokiji's ice while pursuing Ace and thus would have been unable to catch up to him. Or better yet, he could have broken his neck and one of the series' main antagonists would have been taken out there and then. This is completely unrealistic, of course, given that Akainu managed to survive a surprise assault from the enraged strongest man in the world after he had ended up killing Ace. Undoubtedly, plot armor definitely saved Akainu here. Ace also nearly managed to prevent his own execution by escaping from his captivity at Marineford. Despite being restrained with sea stone handcuffs, Ace managed to disarm a nearby guard and defeat the majority of his escort before attempting to make an escape that was quickly stopped by Warden Magellan himself. While he may not have been able to fully escape the government prison, it is entirely possible that Ace could have temporarily eluded Magellan by hiding within the deeper levels of Impel Down, thus delaying the execution. This would have been doubly effective if Ace was still there when Luffy had inspired the mass breakout. Speaking of fortunate timings, Ace also could have been saved if Blackbeard had arrived at Marineford slightly earlier. His presence, combined with some of the most dangerous level 6 prisoners of Impel Down, may have caused enough chaos on the battlefield that Akainu would have been forced to refocus his attention from Ace and Luffy, or at least he would have been too distracted to either taunt Ace or he would have been delayed too much to catch up to the pair. Finally, we have what could have been the most widely loved way in which Ace could have been saved from the depths of Marineford. Within the story, it was Shanks who intervened to stop the Marineford War, but on the battlefield that day, there was another one of Goldie Roger's former cabin boys. Yes, I'm talking about everybody's favorite pirate, Buggy the Clown. If Buggy decided to personally intervene to save his former captain's son, then even the likes of Akainu would have been unable to withstand the pressure of his immense haki, thus ensuring Ace leaves Marineford safe and sound. We've now reached the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. We've talked about some serious and not so serious examples of how Ace could have survived in Marineford, but I want to know your thoughts. What are your theories on how Ace could have survived Marineford? I really look forward to seeing all of you continue the discussion in the comments, and lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and I cannot wait to see you in my next One Piece Explained video. If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.